Hello, this is Derek Hansen for StrengthPowerSpeed.com, and welcome to our third episode of our Performance Concepts Chat. In this episode, we continue our discussion with James Smith on his new book, The Governing Dynamics of Coaching. And we get into some controversial discussion about James's idea that the current strength and conditioning field should not really exist. And he talks about how the sport coaches should have the knowledge to implement all aspects of athlete development, team development, including physical preparation. And he brings up some examples in other fields, other industries, where this is already done, where a head chef or somebody in charge of an orchestra has knowledge of all of the individual components and how to implement things on a very small scale, but also has a broader, more global view of everything. So very interesting that we talk about a generalist approach as opposed to what's been turning into more and more specializations. And James points out the pitfalls of over-specializing. We talk about how to bring about this change, and I think that's going to be the toughest part, is changing people's ideas and perceptions of how things should be done. And creating this paradigm shift will be a huge challenge if James wants to see this idea move forward. And then we transition into a discussion of a topical area right now, this idea of mental toughness created through physical punishment, grueling workouts. And James brings up some very pertinent points about why he doesn't feel that this is a valid way of pursuing this end. So I hope you enjoy our discussion, and I think we'd like some more feedback on what James has brought to the table here. But please enjoy our discussion with James Smith.
So, James, why should we end the role of a physical preparation or strength and conditioning coach?
Yes. So we ask ourselves, what is the most holistic representation of the relationship that could exist between coach and athlete through the mode of preparation? And the answer must equivocally be that the type of relationship that is built upon the same premise as nearly any other successful relationship, which is one that is not factionalized in its administration. And so we conceptualize this coach who, from beginning to end, maintains contact with that athlete. So as you go through a day of preparation, regardless of what the domain is, what the sport is, if there's a field, if there's a track, if there's an ice rink, if there's a ring, if there's an octagon, if there's a pitch, whatever, you go, let's say, from the competitive arena to some supportive arena. Is it a room with weight training equipment? Is it a room with physiotherapeutic equipment? It doesn't matter what the resources are. It's you and that individual. Why? Because that individual is competent to coach you, not partially, globally, in the same way that the competent chef can cook any part of the meal, any set of ingredients, that the competent builder goes through any facet of the building process unassisted. And the only instance in which we have to enter complexity to the situation is if there's the logistical need. So if it's not a single sport athlete, so if it's not just the one athlete, what if it's a team of athletes? Is it logistically feasible to have one coach for 53 American football, National Football League players? Well, that's not very logistically feasible. It's certainly not optimal. So what does that mean? Well, we need to have more coaches, but the same rules apply. There's more coaches, yet each one of those coaches is responsible from beginning to end of being with that athlete, no matter what the preparation consists of, and thereby amending, in one example only, the dysfunction of the strength coach community. By virtue of its existence, it represents a divergence and an interruption of that relationship. The athletes, for right or for wrong, for better or for worse, they have a sense that the coaches who govern the most specific aspects of their preparation demand their greatest attention, right or wrong. But there's an innate sense that if I'm an ice hockey player and I have a coach on the ice with me and he has knowledge of the kinematics and the kinetics of my stick handling and my skating, etc., that individual immediately is going to have some place higher in the hierarchy to most of those players than this other person who talks about what to eat, or this other person who tells them how to squat, or this other person who does this other thing. It's not that they dismiss this other person, it's that their profession is stick handling, shots on goal, defense, etc. And you fill in the blank with whatever sport. So if the individual is high character, high discipline, high work ethic, they're going to be a pleasure to work with for any specialist coach. It doesn't matter. We're not talking about them. We're talking about what usually, stereotypically, is the most talented, the most naturally skilled athletes. They tend not to fit that profile. They tend to be the ones who practice consistently, hard. They compete very well, yet when it comes to, for example, lifting weights, they're not necessarily the champions of that. They're looking to get out of some of it, to do something differently. Why do I have to do this? I'm already great at my sport. That is a stereotype amongst many of the most skilled athletes. Not all, but I'm speaking in generalities here. Now, there's something correct about that inclination for the most skilled to get what they want, because there should be a highly individualized approach taken, and more importantly, the fact that they shifted hands, that they're no longer in this exclusive relationship with the one coach. Now it's this polygamous entity, in which case they get passed from one set of hands to the next and irretrievably separated in terms of specificity. Now, from a philosophical standpoint, I'm not making any argument for or against the concept that clearly there are valid reasons to devote your attention to modes of preparation other than the most specific modes. Undoubtedly so. However, from the athlete's standpoint, it is true that there can be no greater effect on the improvement of skill advancement than measures that serve to advance skill specifically by way of sensory motor aptitudes and then neurophysiological processes associated and the psychological linkage, etc. So if we eliminate the strength coach in favor of an actual competent sport coach, we preserve the relationship. We preserve a greater degree of the relationship, and that alone improves the culture and the thinking of those athletes, of that population that tends to be the most high-performing ones, that are not crazy about as soon as they get into the weight room. Now, all of a sudden, they're with that individual who they've got this strong relationship with based upon that person's most direct influence on sport results, and it's preserved all the way through. So now it's that same individual that then gets into these specialized modes of preparation that are not necessarily the most specific ones, including some that are general, and then in addition to physiotherapeutic modalities. So it's the same individual, simply utilizing different resources. So immediately there's a higher level of cultural galvanization that is achieved due to the preservation of that relationship. And again, we see an example of why this works in the most successful relationships. For instance, in a romantic realm, You know, Derek has been public with his interest in shifting to consulting, part of which those interests is to spend more time with the family. Well, what does that mean? How do we define that? What is happening with the relationship? Well, one facet of it is time, exposure, being in contact with another. So this is an incredibly valuable commodity in order to enhance and amplify what is possible in any given relationship. Time of influence. And so one way of increasing the robustness of that relationship in the sports culture is to ensure that we define coaching competency. One example of defining coaching competency is if you are to coach this athlete, you must thereby be competent in all modes of preparation.
But don't we kind of glorify, like, say, from a societal point of view, don't we kind of glorify the specialist and the person who has expertise in this area, and we probably don't give as much credit to people who are generalists? Like, even in my example, right, like, I want to spend more time with my kids, I want to do more stuff with my family, I want to do more stuff for my home, and, like, you know, somebody might say, like, well, why don't you just hire somebody to do that who specializes in it, where I'm a little different. I want to learn more about other things. I want to be more competent in different areas, and I think that even has created problems within my involvement in sport, because as a track coach, I learned how to do all the therapeutic and rehab modalities and
Yes.
all those things because out of necessity, but also I wanted a hand in it because I was, you know, kind of overseeing everything. And how am I supposed to make decisions on something if I don't have the knowledge to make an educated decision on how that should move forward? So
that's right.
But
that's right.
I think, like, it's also hurt me because people are like, hey, you shouldn't have an opinion on rehabilitation or those types of medical issues because that's not your area. Like, that's this guy's area, yeah, but that guy's not. He doesn't have the same relationship that I have with the athlete, and he doesn't know the history, and so you're starting from the bottom again. And
that's right.
That's what has been frustrating for me, is that I like to think of myself as a generalist, but that hasn't gotten me, any sort of accolades of being a generalist. Like, and I think that's a societal thing or a cultural thing that maybe we're moving away from that too much. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I agree with you. And if we exclude the dysfunctional thinking of those who have been educationally misled, then all we can do is celebrate the fact that you have amassed a more global level of knowledge in all realms pertinent to the endeavor of your athletes. There is no way to rationally criticize that. The very introduction of a criticism specifically against the fact that you have knowledge in all relevant subject matter domains is intrinsically a problem of that person's flawed education. I agree with you that it's prevalent in nearly all modes of hierarchy, sport or otherwise. That, however, does not give a single ounce of credence to its efficacy. So, in simple terms, I agree with you that mode of argument is common, yet it's also completely wrong. Let me give you some examples of the time that it can take for wrong ideas and bad explanations to actually be amended and wholesale corrected such that everyone is the wiser. So I gave examples in one of my book promotional videos of Aristarchus, who made the first heliocentric observations something on the order of 300 something years BC. The first heliocentric observations, which is to state the first observations that the Earth, different from what the church was proclaiming, is not the center of our galaxy about which all other planets orbit. Rather, the sun is the center. This was in 300 something BC. Fast forward almost 2,000 years to the late 1600s when Galileo, due to his advancement of lenses for the telescope, was able to simply present the evidence that this is in fact true. What my friend Johannes Kepler and going back to Aristarchus have been saying, just take a look through the telescope and you'll see that the sun is the center and all other planets are orbiting around it. Well, this was in the mid-late 1600s. That got Galileo house arrest. In fact, he had to renounce his own views just to save his own life. And it was only because he had such respect already from the community and the church that he was given house arrest as opposed to some form of execution. It's insane, but that's the truth of it. That's what happened. So that's nearly a 2,000-year gap between initial observations of the immutable truth and what still had yet to instantiate as the truth, yet more and more we're becoming aware and ultimately leading to the knowledge. And we can go through so many other examples of that over time where you had the initial set of conditions in which the problem was identified and solutions were offered, and then hundreds, if not thousands of, again, the example I'm giving here is almost 2,000 years. So here you have myself and anyone else in this year stating this is the dysfunction. Most coaches are not globally competent. This is flawed. There should be a single architectural blueprint amongst which all neuromuscular structural loading is based upon, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Will it be 2,000 years before, probably not, because the rate of information sharing and technology and so far, and if for no other reason, then I'm not suggesting something that is previously not existed. I'm simply saying look to your left and to your right into the most successful restaurants and the most successful builders and small business owners and orchestral conductors, all these examples that I give in the book with quotes from these people and so on. It already exists. It's existed for thousands of years in these other professions which predate the sport profession by thousands of years. So this is key to understand, and it is only from this more global perspective can we possibly begin to engage in such a conversation, because the myopic lanes of specialization detract away. So again, Derek, the problem is with the dysfunction of the industry. Here you are doing only what any competent chef, general contractor, orchestral conductor, scientist, any competent individual simply must do intrinsically to demonstrate competence. And only because there is so much misinformation floating amidst sport education could not only that not be something that's honored, but just the opposite, in fact, encouraging specialization, creating more and more divergence, and ultimately slowing the growth of knowledge.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely opens up a whole can of worms about, how to again, going back to the question of how do we convince people that this is the right way and that it is a noble cause. And it was interesting. I was watching, I don't know if you saw that movie Snowden. I thought it was pretty interesting.
I did.
So, but going from there, and I wanted to discuss this idea of going back to your military training and your experience and some of the consulting you've been doing. I mean, there is an area where I would think it's difficult to change opinions. I would think there's a thought process that is specialization and not necessarily looking at people who are generalists, but I mean, they even call people specialists. So,
that's right.
What are your opinions on what we can learn from that environment? What your experience is? What are the good takeaways? What are some things we have to be wary of when we look at the military or tactical preparation?
So the first is to understand the underlying dynamics, that umbrella, the whole operation. So it's not that there's sport coaching and tactical leadership on either side of the fence. It's all the same thing on the basis of those underlying dynamics or the governing dynamics, in which case we discuss universal principles. So when the main sections of the book, which are culture, psychology, technique, tactics, sensory, motor, biodynamic, bioenergetic, biomotor, physiotherapeutic intervention. So I've gone through big subject matter domain title headings there and said nothing that would lead anyone to think I'm talking about sport, military, or otherwise. All I'm mentioning is the collective aggregate of human intellectual experience, the science of the brain, the science of sensory recognition and motor operations, the biomechanics, kinetics, kinematics, dynamics, mechanics, medical, all of which are pertinent to all things motion and the conscious entity that is governing the motion. Some of the manifestations of this are this sport, this military job, that military job, all governed by the same set of dynamics without exception. So that's the first point of contention. For example, the consulting that I do with who are ultimately some of my best friends that are still in special operations. In speaking with one individual in the training department, I was given the question, what sports would you most associate these operators to, and how would you suggest that influences how they are prepared? I said, first thing, you're wrong to ask me that question, because it's wrong to make an analogy to some other sport. Their specific objectives must be honored and solved as they stand alone, and it's only a divergence that's created by attempting to approximate their motion dynamics to some other athlete. And I would give the same response to anyone in sport who, if I was consulting with a mixed martial arts coach and they said to me, well, what other sport do you think most closely relates that we could get ideas from? I'd say, well, that's where you're wrong. The problem we have to solve is the only limitations presented by any sport or any tactical direct objective. The limitations are only presented by what is allowed and what is not. So the rules of engagement, whether it's tactical or the rules of competition, or in rugby, the laws of competition, those, same as the laws of physics, dictate what is achievable. So it's another example from physics, and something that David Deutsch has talked about. If something has not been achieved yet it does not, some physical transformation has not been achieved yet it does not violate a known law of physics, then the only reason it hasn't happened is either there's not enough knowledge, or it violates some yet unforeseen, some yet to be known law of physics that hasn't been discovered. So knowledge is always the limiting factor once you understand the rules. So the rules give us all the information we need to solve the sports problem. So what are the rules? And an example of how the strength coaching profession is absolutely backwards is because it's founded upon a set of conditions entirely independent of sport structure, which is to state the science of this barbell exercise, the science of this cardiovascular response to some breathing pattern, the science of this motion with the body here that we do with this specialty device, as opposed to what should have been the collective aggregate education of sport coaching. There never should have been strength coaching. The sport coaching education should have been the problem of sport. So what are the rules? What's allowed? That then dictates tactical possibilities. What are tactics? Tactics are the physical instantiation of the operating mechanisms and the decision making in real time of what's been studied analytically, what's been developed psychologically, what is achievable technically. So how do we advance the technical execution of this? Well, what sort of physical work is required? So we work backwards and backwards and backwards from the problem. I have a quote in the book from Jeff Bezos, the CEO of Amazon, who he talks about this exact same principle, that they have this system of working backwards for product solutions, and it's simply intuitive. Yet somehow it has escaped this aspect of the sport profession that chose to take its direction from the opposite direction. It's confounding, actually, when one thinks of it that way. So these governing dynamics apply the same. It doesn't matter what the physical manifestation of it is, and the same dysfunctions that we've discussed so far in the sport industry exist in the military community. The difference is that, in my judgment, there is much grander advancements culturally specific to certain special operations domains, in which case the nonstop evolution of thinking is intrinsic for not only operational success, but the preservation of life and the minimization of damage sustained. This cultural aspect I reference in the book, and it's based upon an article that I wrote a few years ago called the After Action Review. Now, nearly any military unit is familiar with what an after action review is. However, the way that it is executed in specific special operations, one in particular unit that I'm most familiar with due to the consulting I do and my friends in that unit, is unique in and of itself. And it's a communication vehicle that is void of hierarchy. So there is no hierarchy amongst all constituents of this meeting, and it's a vehicle for criticism. So it speaks entirely to what I referenced earlier regarding what Neil Turok has established at the African Institute of Mathematical Sciences, and what David Deutsch has spoken about being the bedrock of new knowledge creation, this vehicle that criticism represents. The After Action Review is an example culturally of an opportunity to promote evolution in thinking due to the stage that it sets for criticism, and no one's rank has any significance in this meeting. Now, if we extend that more broadly, it can thereby have an even larger impact on an operating unifier with an organization, and the more broad version that I'm postulating here is something that I'm unaware of existing in any particular military or sport unit. And as we go on down the line of what there is to criticize, there's just as much to criticize in the military as there is in sport, and for the same reasons. In terms of ironically, with you could have units that with great effect institute the after action review, yet outside of that still have a host of problems culturally, despite the fact that they honor the concept of an after action review. So, excuse me, that's an example of balkanization, and it exists everywhere. And the most that a governing-minded, globally-minded individual could, who is monitoring all things in terms of physical motion and objectives that have some technical component, tactical component, whatever, would be to gain a deeper understanding of the governing dynamics to therefore realize that it's simply analogous to first developing the knowledge, then expanding the toolkit such that all you're simply doing is redirecting what problem you're going to solve with it. Yet this governing knowledge remains the same.
James, I'm going to jump back away from the military realm and kind of come back into sports. Now, you touched on the problem-solving process, kind of working backwards in terms of what the constraints are of the sports or the domain, and trying to find a way that you can continue to advance, taking those into account. Now, my experience with sports where maybe creativity is more encouraged, or the expression of creativity is fostered by the nature of the sport itself, mainly slopestyle snowboard. You find that the problem-solving process is more innate to the athlete or the coaches, and a lot less formal. And in my experience, the advancement of those sports occurs at a much faster rate than it does with maybe more structured sports or sports that that we're all more commonly aware of or exposed to, like team sports. Now, do you think that's maybe just due to the infancy of those sports, where the growth happens a little bit more exponential and then levels off as it goes on? Or is there something that you've managed to see where the creativity does allow for that problem solving to always be taking place?
So you said it, in that as the tendency is that as infrastructure grows, so do the balkanized dysfunctions. And so if the same economic backing was to go into snowboard preparation, and institutes were developed all around, and teams and organizations, you'd see likely the same problems emerge due to the flaw of hierarchy. So Lawrence Peter, the Peter principle, defines this in an amusing way, actually, because of the way that everyone sees how they're part of it, who's part of a hierarchy. So to summarize, the Peter principle defines Western hierarchy. And the short of it is that people tend to work till they reach their own individual level of incompetence. The result being, in most Western hierarchical organizations, that the highest level positions are occupied by people incapable of doing their work. Now, this feeds straight into the concern you have of freestyle or whatnot snowboarding potentially becoming the same juggernaut that, for instance, baseball is, and what might it look like at that point. Now, there's no reason why the loss of that effective mode of problem solving and that cultural, what makes that culture special by not fragmenting it and isolating aspects of communication that are necessary to solve problems. There's no reason why that cannot be preserved regardless of the economics, the amount of people, the infrastructure. There's no reason why it cannot remain involved. And while I do not have any direct knowledge, my sense is that companies like Apple and Google are an example of this, that have many employees and that foster a much more holistic, open information sharing culture, at least in comparison to so much of the flawed hierarchies that exist in education and sport and business and so on. So there's no reason why it cannot be sustained. And as I indicated earlier, the importance of the top down, the tutoring that I supply to prospective head sport coaches, the meetings that I have with owner. An example, I I did some work privately with who at the time was the outgoing owner of one of the premiership rugby clubs. And so this was the owner, and after I don't even know if it might not even have been a week of just us having conversations, he said to me, James, had I only met you when I first bought the team. That's an example of the fastest mode of error correction, is if it's being instilled from the top down. What happens is you have individuals that say that I consult with an assistant sport coach or a physical preparatory coach or a physiotherapist or a track coach or whoever, and they're lower in the operational hierarchy. Okay, so now there's an individual who's part of the organization who has the knowledge, but they have the least advantageous position to affect the creation of new knowledge on levels above them due to the dysfunction of the hierarchy that's set in place in the first place. Alternatively, if it's the owner or the executive or the director or the stake shareholders, people at the top who are then who then improve their knowledge and acceptance of this type of evolutionary. It's only evolutionary because it doesn't exist in sport. As I said, we could just point to our left and our right. The irony is that, I could go into most fast food restaurants and point to the supervisor as a person that this professional sports coach could learn from, simply because of what that individual must have knowledge of in order to supervise the kitchen, even though it's a fast food restaurant, let alone some 3-star Michelin rated restaurant. So this is important to know. And there's just no reason why the way you characterized the culture of slope style snowboarders, there's no reason why that cannot be preserved regardless of how big the sport gets, outside of bad judgment and a lack of knowledge.
So just to kind of stay on the subject here, one of the things that has driven the advancement of that sport has been the athletes themselves, and in the way that they perform new tricks and they problem solve in terms of how to improve their routines. How can we kind of lay the ground? What can we do to maintain that open information sharing line bottom up and empower athletes to be part of the process?
So I would argue against the bottom up, because that's a bit like saying, I want to get from Miami to Vancouver as fast as possible, and despite the fact that there's airplanes, I'm going to walk. So tell me how fast I can walk. So that's why I would argue against the bottom up, simply because it's basically a request to make the best of a worst case scenario. So instead, I'll give you the best of a best case scenario, which is that simply everyone is given the opportunity to develop the right knowledge as it relates to preserving what is already an excellent working model. That is the unequivocal right solution, that the athletes themselves, first and foremost, are guided towards those informational resources, which are not encapsulated by specific sport specialties. In the email, Derek, that you sent me earlier regarding some of the things we would discuss here.
Yep.
I cannot have an intelligent conversation. This is sort of an example I'm making to answer your question, John. I couldn't even have an intelligent conversation about the state of physical preparation or strategies used, because I don't know the answer to that. I have nothing to do with that profession. Ironically, even though I worked in the profession for a period of years, I never looked to that profession to advance my knowledge. What I looked to was What are one or two of these track coaches or physicists or executive chefs or orchestral conductors? I quite literally gained probably upwards of 95% of my knowledge of what to do in terms of coaching tactics from non-sport related sets of influences. And the reason why, in my view, that same opportunity must be preserved for all these snowboarders and everybody else is because the knowledge that exists that is pertinent to understand must not be riddled with bias by way of being interpreted by a medium, which is to say a coach. So all any coach can do is interpret as much as what is possibly knowable in more, particularly if it relates to more fundamental knowledge. All they can do is interpret that into their trade craft, combined with creativity, etc. They are an interpreter. Whether or not it's knowledge that they gained or if it's just received wisdom and they're copying somebody else, they're an interpreter of orchestrating workload. Now, the fundamental or the more fundamental areas of knowledge then go in to what is contained under the headings that I list in the book: culture, psychology, technique, tactics, sensory motor, biodynamics, bioenergetics, biomotor constituents, medical and physiotherapeutic interventions, analytical and intellectual modes of discourse. These are the governing dynamics under which the rabbit holes go very, very deep the more you want to go down any particular lane of some subfield of psychology or some subfield of biochemistry or mechanical systems or medical sciences. And no single individual can possibly be as knowledgeable in all fields relative to what is knowable today. There's simply too much information today, too much accessibility to it for any one individual to be the foremost expert on all of them. The best that can happen is that this leader, who the competent head coach, the best that they can have is a working understanding such that they are the ones most qualified to actually be the head coach. So as it regards the snowboarders, again, simply ensure that from get-go the athletes are engaged in this type of conversation. The most that any of us could possibly ask for professionally is that, athletes included, is that the only limiting factor between us and us achieving what the cards have in store for us, the only limiting factor is ourselves. That's the most that any of us could answer. That we're not being hindered by a closed-minded supervisor or an authoritative coach or you name it, but rather to be able to say to ourselves, I am the only thing standing in my way. No one is restricting me. Every opportunity is available to me. Every resource is open to me. That's the most any of us could possibly ask for, such that our own intellect and ultimately knowledge could be the only limiting factor. So right down to the athlete. That's the best possible situation. And in a sports organization, whether it's a single sport, Olympic, cyclical athletes, or team sport, combat, whatever, that the leadership of that organization embodies these cultural attributes that instill ownership, that instill creativity, that instill a culture of criticism in which everyone is subject to being criticized in the spirit of advancing new knowledge. That's the most anyone could ask for in any professional environment, sport being one of them.
Now, John and I are on the same page with you with a lot of this. And have you encountered, like when you describe this sort of comprehensive approach, or do people look at you and you say, like, that's so pie in the sky, that's so idealistic, how could you even think that we could move to that? Like, do you encounter that kind of resistance?
So, not entirely, because, as you just said, there's any rational thinker could not possibly formulate an argument against a lack of intelligence being associated with what I just explained. Mm-hmm. It cannot be done. All that can be done is, for instance, I was speaking with a head NFL coach a year ago, mm-hmm. Having a similar conversation, and similarly, he was agreeing with the logic behind it, but his question was, okay, James, how do we do this? So naturally, and fair question indeed, and that's what that's what I'm supposed to have the answer to, because I'm being paid as the consultant, and so that's more of it. It's as I said earlier in our discussion, there's the truth of it, and people cannot argue that. It's the way that they're confronted with the fact that the truth is turning so much utterly upside down relative to everything they've ever been told and everything they've been exposed to.
It's like converting from fossil fuels to more sustainable forms of energy, right? Like, there's a huge investment, there's an infrastructure component behind it, there's a cultural, whatever, there's financial barriers. Right. It's kind of the same hurdle, right? The same huge hurdle.
That's right. Every paradigm shift, and everyone who's been around at the time of a paradigm shift would be able to speak to this same set of circumstances. And this goes back to the beginning of human history. So it's nothing new. This conversation, it's nothing new. Yet the means to the speed at which evolution can occur, we have a unique. One could argue that we have a unique set of circumstances amidst this technological revolution due to the rate of information acquisition that can ultimately facilitate ideas and conjectures that can lead to new knowledge, etc. So this is a time like no other, and as soon as quantum computers and the rest come into play, that's just going to be another world-changing event, universe actually changing event, and who knows what's going to happen at that point. But even now, just simply the fact that we have the internet is hugely advantageous with respect to mitigating the differential. This is the endeavor, mitigating the differential between all that is knowable and all that one actually knows. And, by the way, this is also the recipe for mitigating, if not eliminating, the possibility for regret. So here's another universal principle. What I just said has nothing to do with sport or military or anything else, yet it has everything to do with those endeavors and every other human endeavor, in which case regret is a possibility. So regret is only possible in one set of conditions, in which case objective thinking failed to be actualized at the point of decision making. If in any decision objective thinking is maximized, which is to say that some reasonable level of attention was spent towards exhausting all that is knowable as it could possibly pertain to the outcome of that decision. Say, if a reasonable effort is exhausted in order to gain that knowledge, regardless of what the decision is and regardless of what the outcome is, there's little to no regret possible resultant of that individual knowing that they exhausted this reasonable level of effort in making the most objective decision. The decisions, and we all have them, that we regret in life, without exception, are utterly and absolutely related to a lack of optimized objectivity imparted in that decision-making process without exception.
Now, I mean, you touched on this idea that the internet gives us this ability to connect and spread knowledge.
Yes.
You know, John had got me a book. What was it? The Signal and Noise book. Was that the one where they talked about the printing press? And the problem with the printing press was that it also allowed people to disseminate mass volumes of incorrect information as well. Do you see that? I mean, do you see some momentum here? Like we talk about the physical preparation field, and although you haven't spent a lot of time within that field, you understand the challenges that are being faced by that field, and some of the momentum is heading further away from what you're espousing here. What are your thoughts on that?
Indeed, and clearly one reason for that is the fact that the field shouldn't exist in the first place. So you have something that should not exist in the first place, and now we're talking about the problems that it's experiencing. So it's is that an infinite regress? Maybe that's if you kick it up a level and it still doesn't solve the problem. So it's a conundrum inside a, what do they call it? A paradox inside a conundrum inside of something else. So so knowledge is always the limiting factor. And as it regards physical preparation, find me a motion problem that does not in and of itself consist of underlying physical mechanisms. So the answer is you cannot. So a torque force, quite literally, no human motion, I mean no motion whatsoever, eyelids blinking, digital flexion, whatever, no human motion is achievable void of some one or more muscles applying a torque force to some other bony or soft tissue segment. So no motion is possible without some torque force being generated to mobilize our skeleton. So then, how can a technical preparatory measure that requires some facet of physical motion not be physical preparation? Likewise, how can any mode of physical preparation not have a technical component in order to ensure its mechanical efficiency? So everything is physical and everything is technical, yet somewhere along the lines, the powers that be who lacked the proper knowledge devised these balkanized terminologies. That's the only explanation. Just based upon the example that I just gave, find me any sport practice, gross movement form or otherwise, that is geared towards skill focused, technique focused, in attempt to divorce what is happening from underlying physical components, from the motor cortex affecting the peripheral segments of the body that are manifesting motion. It's all physical. It's all physical preparation, but wait a minute, it's all technical preparation because we cannot justify a mechanical flaw in motion. So now where are we? Now what are we going to call it? So I just come back to sport coaching. You coach this sport, you coach that sport, and that's the end of it. And I would challenge anyone to form an intelligent argument against the efficacy of which, part of the argument cannot possibly be steeped in, oh, but that's never going to happen, or what are the chances of that happening? That's a bad effort. That's not a sufficient explanation. The fact remains is anyone would be hard-pressed to offer a rational counter-argument against what I'm stating for a host of reasons, only some of which, we've discussed thus far.
Okay. So we're going to finish big here, and I just, I want to get into this topic of mental toughness, and I know you've talked about it in terms of, specificity of mental toughness and all that. And obviously, the physical preparation side has kind of brought this into the fold that we're going to physically punish people in order to make them mentally tough, and we encounter that with sport coaches being their primary motive behind physical preparation is to make people mentally tough. What are your thoughts on that? How do we shift the emphasis away from that to the appropriate areas that you're talking about in your book? And you know, I mean, that's an entirely different area on its own that I think has taken over the field. And there's people within the field who know that that's an expectation of their job, regardless of whether or not they want to engage in it or they think it's valid.
Well, lo and behold, another reason for the abomination of the existence of the field, because mental toughness is science fiction. So mental toughness is the Easter Bunny. It's spoken about, and all sorts of different households of people in and out of sport say the word, and no different from the Easter Bunny or the Tooth Fairy, let alone I start naming out monotheistic deities. Science fiction. Here's why. So again, another example of the abomination of the field, as you said, by its very determination, being endeavored to solve this problem of it, what's in fact science fiction. Here's the truth of it. There are an aggregate of psycho-behavioral attributes that get inaccurately glossed over with the term mental toughness. Inaccurately. So not only is mental toughness not real, it's not an acronym, nor is it an accurate word to consolidate a larger group of words whose specific understanding is utterly intrinsic in order to affect sport outcomes, rooted in any deficiency therein. For example, let's do it out in real time here. If I say, you know what, you cannot use that word anymore because it's science fiction and we're grown-ups now, and we're not going to say that the Easter Bunny has anything to do with sport outcomes. So use specific language and tell me what psycho-behavioral attributes are you referring to that some athlete would do well to enhance upon? What would you say then?
It's a good question.
Yeah, I'm still thinking of the Easter Bunny.
Yes. So
let's say confidence or assertiveness.
Yeah, well done. Confidence is one of them. So we have, I'll just rattle off a handful. You have confidence, self-regulation, focus under pressure, emotional management, tenacity, aggression, etc.
Grit.
So, yes, right? So, and an example that I've used is two divergent qualities, resolve and aggression. Two that are highly intrinsic to any form of particularly combative sport, whether or not one has pads on or gloves on or kicks or punches or tackles or whatever, skates. Aggression and resolve. So aggression is much more of an overcoming act. It's more of an offensive act. Resolve, which is defined by one being undeterred by setbacks, has much more to do with how one responds to error. So both highly relevant to a variety of sport and life applications. And the physical, so if we have our analytical intellectual discussion of define aggression and define resolve, okay, then everyone develops some level of an understanding of it. We talk about it more deeply to deepen our understanding, etc. Now we say, okay, now let's put it into practice. Let us institute physical motion in which the adaptation to this motion is increased aggression or increased resolve. What will happen is those modes of physical instantiation will be very different in order to amplify the aggressive component or to amplify the resolve an individual possesses. Same as if we go down the line of ways of physically instantiating modes of irritants that will yield adaptive responses in tenacity, in management of the motions, in self-confidence, self-control, and so on and so forth. So by virtue of this, what I'm saying, clearly one must have a deep enough understanding of what they're actually talking about by using the science fiction word mental toughness, thinking more specifically, what am I actually referring to? Understanding that the definition of that psycho-behavioral attribute and how to develop it. Mental toughness is not real, and so the examples we'll do a group think here. So, give me one sport and one profession that's not the military and not sport. So one sport and one non-sport, non-military profession, both of which, in your minds, necessitates that an individual to be very successful, either in that sport or in that profession, in your mind, they must, we'll continue to use the Easter Bunny, they must be mentally tough to excel in their respective professions. So give me one sport and one non-sport.
My initial example of non-sport, it would be somebody who's in the military, like a soldier.
Well, let's not make it that easy.
Okay.
Well, how about say like nursing profession? So you're like around people who are sick or emergency situations. They have to handle the stress of that situation. They have to be mentally tough if they see somebody pass away and they have to go back to work. So that would be one.
That's right.
Sporting, the one that John and I had some experience with was tennis. We found that the tennis players that we had worked with were rather, I'm not going to say mentally fragile, but because every point, there's so many points in a game, and if you miss one point, you could, collapse and lose the whole set, and that was one of them. There wasn't a physical combative sport.
Sure.
So the only other example that I can maybe sort of think about is in terms of defining that broader topic of mental toughness and breaking it down into more specific components, would maybe be biathlon, where you maybe have to manage your emotions in terms of having any sort of negative association to the effort that you're having to expend during the cross-country skiing part, but then also having able to settle yourself for the shooting components. That would be my sport example.
So great. And in fact, we could pick any sport and any endeavor. But let's go with nursing and tennis or biathlon. Fine. Now, we have, how do we be objective in the discussion of psychological preparation? Well, we want to be able to work with quantities, quantitative evaluation. So lo and behold, what type of quantities do we evaluate in order to determine someone's level of focus, of emotional control? Well, we look at what a physiological stress reaction and how it is measured. So we look at the quantities of heart rate, blood pressure, galvanic skin response, perspiration, respiratory rate. So these are all objective quantities that we can measure very accurately. So now, if I present no controversy by stating, no one would argue that the most astute trauma room nurse, similarly to the highest performing on the world stage tennis player or biathlete, each individual in their own domain, if we're monitoring their physiology. So the nurse in the trauma room, in the arena, the tennis player on the court, in the Wimbledon, the biathlete in the Olympics. So each one of them in the grandest stage of volatility as it regards their discipline. It's uncontroversial to state that the highest performers are going to show the smallest deviations in a flat line. If we think of the needle on a polygraph or on an EKG, we're expecting to see the least amount of fluctuations in terms of changes in blood pressure, heart rate, galvanic skin response, perspiration, etc. Why? Because the individual is focused, they're undeterred, they're ready to go. So whether it's the nurse, the tennis player, the biathlete, it doesn't matter. It's uncontroversial to state that their level of focus will be heightened and they will be impervious to all things happening around them outside of their control. No controversy there, correct?
Nope.
Right? Now what happens if we switch their roles? What happens if we take the tennis player and the biathlete and we throw them in the trauma room to assist the vascular surgeon? And what happens if we throw that nurse who's never played tennis or the biathlete, we throw them out on the court at Wimbledon and out either on the range or with the skis and the biathlon? Now what happens to those quantities that we're measuring? Now all of a sudden, we're monitoring a stress response because that biathlete doesn't know what to do with this ruptured femoral artery. And this person is bleeding to death. And that nurse has never played tennis before. And they're about to be humiliated in front of a viewing audience of 50 million people around the world. Now all of a sudden, we're seeing these objective quantities being affected. Well, what happened? I thought they were mentally tough. Doesn't mentally tough mean focused? Doesn't mentally tough mean not having a panic attack when you're doing your thing? So what happened is you're trained or you're untrained. There's no such thing as tough. And that's actually a quote from the movie Man on Fire with Denzel Washington, in which he gives that lesson to the young girl in the swimming pool. That's the truth of it. That a stress reaction, particularly the greater the magnitude of these different quantities being disrupted from a focused state, is the antithesis of what is inaccurately termed mentally tough. There's no controversy in that. So therefore, mental toughness or whatever cannot exist. You're simply prepared or you're not. And that's the end of it. We can plug and play with any profession. We can go to the mixed martial artist or the wrestler and the Navy SEAL and the Marine Force recon. None of them are mentally tough. They're simply trained for their discipline. And it's for the same reason why that Navy SEAL who's never played tennis is going to show a stress reaction when they're out there just immediately thrust onto the court at Wimbledon without any advance notice. Just the way that tennis player is going to have a stress reaction when they're thrown in with a group of Navy SEALs getting ready to jump out of an airplane at 33,000 feet in the middle of the night with night vision. So no one is mentally tough. It's simply that the best of the best are well trained, and then we associate the psychobehavioral attributes that are specific to that set of circumstances. And so where we do have the commonalities shared between is the self-control, the emotional management, the resolve, the focus under pressure. Now we apply that to all athletes, all professions, all military. Great, we're using specific language, none of which consists of the science fiction term of mental toughness, which is neither true nor accurate nor real.
Yeah, it was interesting watching that movie with Tom Hanks, the one about the guy who landed the plane in the Hudson, Sully.
Sully, yes.
Yeah, and that's a perfect example there. I mean, it was his knowledge and preparation. It wasn't, and his skill. It wasn't that he was mentally tough, and quite honestly, he had the skill to do it. And I think he still suffered from some sort of PTSD after that. But that, and then the air traffic controller that was involved too.
That's right. It's 100%. So it's, again, just another example of the misinformation, because as you stated, this realm of physical preparation is consumed with this chasing the solution to this subject matter. Turns out what they're chasing a shadow. They're chasing the Easter bunny. Mm-hmm. What the solution is not for one particular factionalized element of the dysfunctional coaching architecture to understand, but the head coach, him or herself, the fact that there are a specific set and proportion of psychobehavioral attributes that are most relevant to that sport or athletes or discipline in question, and those must be fully understood on the analytical intellectual level first in order to ensure that the instantiation of motion preparation that is intended to improve these attributes is in fact going to give you what you expect to see.
Yeah, and you're not chasing the Easter bunny off a cliff, it seems like yes. What's happening to the detriment of the athletes.
That's correct.
So, well, I think that's a lot of information, James, that I'm excited to get out to people, and I once we post this, I would hope there was some discussion that came from it. We're going to post it on a couple of different mediums here, and see if we can get people to talk more about it, because as you said, we have to start advancing knowledge, and we have to start changing the way we look at these things, and it's got to start somewhere, and hopefully it doesn't take 2,000 years, but this is a good start, and I hope you get some more interest in your book, and maybe you can even engage some of the people that kind of comment on this. We'll figure out a way to do it, and we'll do a follow-up with you as well. Anything else to add, John?
I just, I'm still thinking, and that's how I know that I've enjoyed this conversation. It's just I'm still thinking about how I could go about applying it, and how this conversation kind of affects my own thought process. So thanks for all the information, but one thing that I do want to make sure is that we get the information out there in terms of how people can get their hands on your book. So can you give us some details on how they would go about that?
Yeah, thank you very much. The title is The Governing Dynamics of Coaching, and it is available on Amazon.
Awesome. So we'll put that link up as well, and if there's anything else we can do for you, let us know, and we'll definitely be in touch.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to have this discussion, Derek and John, and it is discussions such as this one that, if multiplied and as rapidly as possible throughout not only the sports world but all professional cultures out there, that will serve to achieve the evolution that is so needed.
Yes, absolutely.
Thanks, James.
Yeah, we're gonna keep in touch, and let's. I'm interested again just to see how everything is received. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, James.
So we hope you've enjoyed our discussion with James Smith on his ideas for the sport preparation field. While you may or may not agree, we'd still like to hear your feedback, and you can get us at strengthpowerspeed.com. You can also get us on Twitter at Strength Power Speed, where there's no vowels in Strength Power Speed, and same on Facebook, Strength Power Speed. We'll also be posting this on YouTube, where you can provide some comments. But most of all, we'd just like to hear from you, and I guarantee you we'll be talking with James very soon to review some of the feedback and see if he has any new ideas on how he thinks this can move forward. So thank you very much for joining us on strengthpowerspeed.com.